A male could be seen panting heavily while making his way through a building, reaching the top of the flight of stairs while still processing everything that had happened, and how he was in the game world that he had always played when he was previously a player of said game. As he stared at the reflection of himself in the window, the dark-haired male wondered if he should get a cheat skill to be feared, confused as to why he was in the form he was currently in. But how did this all start? It was a normal day for the male who had a video game wallpaper on his work computer, glancing over at the clock in his workplace, which made him freeze in place, while waiting for the hands to hit a certain time. When it was 5:30, the dark-haired male abruptly stood up from his seat and put on his backpack, telling the others good work, as was customary when leaving a workplace. The door made a click, and the others continued on with their daily work, annoyed at the behavior of the male, since he had really gone home on time in such a situation, and assumed it was likely because of a certain video game. They were surprised to see this male so desperate like this, even though it was just a stupid game in their eyes. The male walked into his apartment where there were posters and a shelf filled with figurines, immediately grabbing at his headset. He realized that he got home a little faster when it was only a 10-minute walk away from his workplace, just to play the Dungeon Explorer Chronicle, or Dunx for short. As he put the virtual headset on, our protagonist could feel himself going through that familiar transitional feeling into the game. With the beautiful graphics and action, Dunx took over the VR MMO game genre. Back then, there were even times when the game went unnoticed, but with its quality and content, it had become a big name, and there was no gamer who didn't know about it. When the dark-haired male entered the game, he realized there was a monster behind him, reminding him that he had left in a rush previously and saved in a weird place. The golem tried to attack the male, but he knew how to get by in the game he was addicted to. After a while of playing, he realized the time and took a break to get a drink. The game's update was at 6 p.m., so he felt glad that his work was over an hour before. One of the reasons why he chose that workplace, after all. He couldn't miss out on it since he was selected as a beta tester for this update, which was meant to be large scale. All beta testers would be rewarded if they did well in the event, but the male couldn't help but get excited just by the sound of the update. Even if it was a little early, he saw that other people were there, and seemingly making friends with each other. The aura was putting him off, but the male realized that he was nervous, attempting to calm himself down while in the presence of other testers. Testers were the few players who were able to glimpse the future, and the event that was magnifying his nervous feelings. But it was going to be okay since he wasn't the average player. At least, that's what he thought. 6 o'clock struck and rumbling could be heard, as the dark-haired male turned around and widened his eyes in shock, as something towered over the entire area. Much time after the event, the male found himself waking with an indescribable expression, walking to work as normal and typing away at his desk while people would wonder what was going on with him. He was still going home on time and his desk was still filled with merch, but he seemed to not be that desperate anymore. When he left to return home again, he thought about how a couple of weeks had passed. In conclusion, the event was one of the most exhausting ones he had been through. A huge dragon suddenly fell and destroyed 10% of the players from the start, immediately firing off lasers randomly when it got up, and it had thick skin to prevent damage. After sacrificing half of the participants, people were able to defeat the dragon. But that was only the start of the event. The venue collapsed and people had to find a way to exit the death game, along with there being a time limit, and a lot of instant kill traps and strong monsters that would blast people away with ease. Even so, our protagonist was not doing the worst, and was able to slash through some of the monsters before more would appear. The only thing that a person could count on was their luck, and this whole event was something that no one other than our protagonist could clear, making the dark-haired male jump for joy in the middle of his walk home. He returned, took a shower, and ate a meal before immediately jumping into the game, looking forward to the update mail that he received, checking it and getting scared by the amount of text. It was an agreement contract that said he would get transported when he started the game, confusing him, until he dismissed it as just the admins being crazy, and that he shouldn't think too deeply. It asked if he wanted to choose his character or let the game automatically choose, to which the male thought it would take too much time to do himself, so he picked automatic. And it sent him to an area where he sat in an auditorium with a familiar man and other familiar students who stood out. With all of this, our protagonist realized that he was in Dunx's opening scene, continuing to listen to the speech while confused about what was going on, since everything felt more real than usual computer graphics. He tried to calm himself down while gathering his thoughts, knowing that this didn't seem to be the actual game since he couldn't even feel the goggles. If this wasn't a dream, it seemed as though he was really transported into the game. But there were two possibilities. His consciousness was transported, or his whole body was overwritten into this new body. But he couldn't figure it out until he logged out. In the game, that would only happen after moving to the classroom. But our protagonist wondered if he really wanted to go home. His class was told to exit and he realized he was in Class E, that class having the lowest status among all 5 classes, but it seemed to be better than getting bullied by those of higher status. The question of returning popped up again, and he had a lot of responsibilities, but he wanted to be overpowered in this world and get involved with his favorite character, along with most of the heroines being enrolled in this class. He believed he was transported in a favorable condition, and wanted to enjoy the world to its fullest, but he was confused as to why he was out of breath just from the stairs. When he saw his reflection in the window, he slammed against it with disbelief when he recognized it, remembering this character to be someone who repeatedly approached one of the heroines and kept harassing her and the main character, leading to the character getting defeated and expelled. Narumi Saota, who was nicknamed Butao, which meant pig. That body was going to be trouble for him both physically and socially, especially since the heroine that this character approached was Hayase Kaoru, a person who didn't treat anyone differently except for Butao. Along with that, the character had already harassed her even before the entrance ceremony, so she should already hate Butao, someone who isn't even the main character's rival. Even if our protagonist had no feelings for this character, Butao was just an unpleasant mob character, so it seemed as though autopick was the wrong move. After this, Kaoru was going to become the core of the main characters, so he didn't want to do anything conspicuous. But that was when the dark-haired male felt an uneasy feeling that wasn't his own emotions. He realized that some of Butao's memories and feelings might have remained, making the problems increase. The male decided to dismiss this and just go to class, as there was still a chance he could log out, since he was transported in the first place. But this was no longer the game world that he knew. Now that he was Butao, Dunx's storyline was going to break, but he still wanted to try and get on good terms with Kaoru. When he walked through the doorway, the girl looked in his direction, making him gain a bit of hope, before she started to glare intensely, which confirmed there was likely no way to get on good terms. Thus, our protagonist's first time transported to another world was starting. As the dark-haired male entered the class and saw Kaoru glare at him before turning her face away with her head leaning on her hand, the male started to tear up and chuckle to himself as he was able to confirm her despise for Butao. Our protagonist hummed and thought, and knew that the seat placement was based on our grades, meaning he couldn't randomly sit wherever he liked, finally finding his name tag, which had the desk placed at the furthest possible place. Another problem was placed on top of the others, and the male knew that he was the lowest ranking student, but this was the adventurer's school that had the entrance exam, which should have been 100 times harder than other schools, as this was a super elite school. Our protagonist didn't know how he did it, but Butao somehow won against the entrance exam, and getting enrolled here alone was incredible, so he should try to have some confidence. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of someone else walking into the classroom, a man in a suit who told everyone to go to their seats as he was going to start the homeroom session. This man was Murai Hajime, an alumni of Adventurers University, and he did a simple self-introduction before explaining about the school, still following Dunx's scenario as normal. This was Dunx's scenario, but the young male witnessed everything firsthand in reality, and realized that everything had a different information density, feeling he could feel the weight of every word that Murai was saying. The male could feel the anxiety of his classmates, but that was how it was supposed to be. Speaking of adventurers in this world, it was a promising profession that got the limelight, and was a name given to those who were allowed to dive into dungeons. But the competition at the school was tough. Just being a student from this school had its own privileges, but our protagonist already knew most of it, even if nothing felt real to him. However, he couldn't go back for a while, and he thought it would be better if he just started thinking seriously about his career in this world. Fortunately, as expected from an elite school, there were a lot of options to do after graduating, such as being scouted, since students would dive into dungeons as lessons. To begin with, Dunx got its name from the fact that they used dungeon exploring as the theme, and it was necessary to have this high focus, since resources from the dungeon would help support the energy industry. For companies and institutions that wanted to progress their dungeon research, this was the best place to hunt for them. For the sake of his future, our protagonist wanted to dive more aggressively, but there were going to be problems. The teacher told everyone that they had each other to work together with, and started handing over the terminals they were going to wear, calling the young male last as expected. If he could return to his previous world, then all his worry would be for nothing. The terminal looked just like a wristwatch, and was the menu in Dunx, having usual smartphone features and many others, such as checking status and logging out. When he opened up the terminal, the screen showed his own current status, but he realized the stats were extremely low, causing him to feel even more angry since the problems kept stacking up. But he still hoped for a logout function. Alas, there wasn't one. At the same time, in Class D, the teacher left, and everyone stayed seated at their desks. There was a short-haired male who was lying in someone's lap, and a student piped up, asking someone how long she should stay sitting, to which the long dark-haired man said until Kariya woke up. This man told everyone to relax, as he was going to head out soon and raid Class E soon enough. Back to Class E, our protagonist was sad that he had no idea how to return, but this was his dream, even despite being transported as Butao. When he checked his status, he saw a glutton skill, and despite having played Dunx for years, didn't even know what it is. To get a skill from the start was pretty rare, but he had no idea how to use it, and it sounded like it was a skill to eat a huge amount of food, making him wonder if it was there because he was fat. Either way, his thoughts were interrupted when he saw a group of people walking into the classroom with serious expressions, one of them shouting at everyone to listen up. He announced that the tall man was from Class D, and was named Kariya Isamu, and that he was going to pick someone to be his subordinate, ordering everyone to show their status and skills. Suddenly, a voice called out, and that came from Kaoru, who stood up, telling the group they had no reason to show their skills, causing others to have the confidence to agree. The male of the group who spoke questioned who the girl was, reminding the class of their status before walking up, and asking Kaoru if she thought they were equals, when his class had been diving into dungeons since they were 12 years old. He told them that their levels were different, and that his words were an order, seemingly giving off an intimidating aura that affected the entire class, including our protagonist. This effect caused the young male to realize what was happening, but everyone saw Kaoru get too affected by the aura and decided to back down. The male asked if anyone else wanted to complain, but the young male knew that this ability, aura, was something that could be used in special places like dungeons towards others with lower levels, in order to intimidate them. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the man calling out to him, wanting to see Saota's stats first. The young male looked toward the equally overweight male and was confused by the fact that this man called him fat, but he got up and showed his terminal anyway. With a laugh, the male said that our protagonist's status was too low, and that they didn't need him, making Saota wish to punch the guy, but he was going to act like the weak guy for now. This man called upon the next student, and he made a female student come up next, one with long hair, a timid face, and a curvy body. She sweat-dropped and fidgeted with her hands before the long, dark-haired male asked her what her name was, making her hesitate for a moment before saying it was Sanjo Sakurako. The male ordered her to show her terminal as expected, but our protagonist recognized the girl whose nickname was Pink due to the color of her hair, and she was one of the heroines in Dunx, also being a special playable character. Through her perspective, a player can find the male character's route, and she was one of the reasons why Dunx was a big hit. The long dark-haired man checked her terminal and saw she was a level 1 as expected, while her abilities were questionable, but he grinned evilly and said that he was going to give her special treatment and let her into their party since she was cute. The girl didn't know how to react and started to shake anxiously, similar to how everyone else in the class was paralyzed by fear from the sheer difference in power. Even if everyone in Class E grouped together, they still wouldn't be able to defeat Kariya, but our protagonist knew that Pink wouldn't be taken away by these men. As the long dark-haired male tried to grab at the girl, he asked why she had such a negative reaction when she should be happy, but his hand was roughly grabbed by a boy in the class who glared at the male, and shouted that the girl obviously didn't like that. This was the scene where the main character of the game showed up. Kaoru stood there, frozen in shock, while thinking about the reason why she enrolled in the adventure school in the first place. Her eyes were wide as she looked forward at the red-haired male, who stopped the long dark-haired man from grabbing at Sanjo. The other male felt a vein pop in frustrated confusion, pulling his arm back while questioning the red-haired male's words, and trying to say that Sanjo was happy about this, even though it was obvious that she wasn't. After asking who the red-haired male was, he introduced himself as Akagi Yuma, proclaiming himself to be the soon-to-be strongest man in the school. Everyone seemed surprised by the declaration, and someone opened one of their eyes, while the other two of the group laughed amongst themselves, making fun of the red-haired male. But Kariya seemed to be especially affected by the words, letting out an intimidating aura of his own, towering over Yuma with a glare. While the rest of the class was affected by this ability, however, Yuma stood tall. Kariya told the male that he was just some kid who didn't know what a real adventurer was, telling Yuma to stop getting ahead of himself, to which the other men of the group tried to calm Kariya down and explained that the words were likely just nonsense, coming from a Class E small fry. With that, the tall man actually calmed down and let out a huff, checking his terminal before asking Yuma if he was fine with a month's time before he would personally test his statement on who was the strongest. This would be tested in a duel with a safety rule, explaining to Yuma that he wouldn't die even if he lost, explaining that there were a lot of guys as strong as monsters at this school, so if the red-haired male couldn't even beat Kariya, it was going to be impossible to call himself the strongest. Kariya asked Yuma if he was wrong, but the red-haired male only tightened his fist and grinned at the words, accepting the invitation. Kaoru and the rest of Class E were surprised by the fact that Yuma accepted this so easily, and without any hesitation, while Kariya felt a vein pop on his face in anger, proceeding to walk away in a large stride, saying he would remember these words. His last words telling Yuma that he hoped he would be ready to lose an arm, the tall male left as Yuma paused for a moment, leaving the class in silence until they started shouting collectively in awe and excitement. They called the boy incredible, which shocked him by their behavior, walking up to him to continue the compliments. Kaoru sat there in silence as she still processed what happened, hearing the other classmates cheer the boy on or thank him for saving them. Someone noble like Yuma was the type of adventurer that Kaoru wanted to be, and the reason why she enrolled at this school was because she admired these kinds of things. However, at the same time, she was also enrolled here to stay away from a certain man. That man being her fiancé, Narumi Sota. In the past, Kaoru could remember when she was walking up the stairs toward the direction of her school, walking along with Sota. She held at the skirt on her body, feeling as though there was someone gazing toward that part, as she asked the boy why he was walking that far away from her, and the dark-haired male apologized and explained that he couldn't go any faster. The girl felt as though their relationship was better when they were kids, remembering him as a bit of a coward but seeing him as a lot more honest than he was, and that he would always give her a gentle smile. When she was picked on by the boys, Sota would even intervene and try to protect her, but now he was just a shadow of his former self, and getting away from him became Kaoru's motivation to take the entrance exam. When she received the letter of acceptance from the adventurer's school, Kaoru stared at the paper and collapsed to the ground in shock, blushing with a soft smile to herself until she later got a call from Sota and heard that he was also accepted. The boy told Kaoru that he was looking forward to the next 3 years with her, and she hesitantly praised him for the achievement, but she couldn't believe that he had chased her and entered the school as well. Sota's family ran a standard general store, and his parents and little sister often worried about Kaoru, so Sota likely didn't do anything illegal, which made the girl see Sota in a new light again. Later, during a time when Kaoru had won a nationwide tournament with her sword skills, she was asked by Sota's parents to teach the boy sword skills, to which the girl accepted with a sweat drop. Sota himself would sometimes ask for the training, and this was something Kaoru now couldn't refuse, since Sota's parents had always been good to her since she was little, and she thought of this as a reward for the boy passing the entrance exam. As they started to run together, she wondered how much effort that this lazy boy put in, which impressed her. It all seemed to be good until they truly started training, which meant having to make sacrifices and changes to one's life. But Sota wouldn't limit his food or wake up early. Even if he did wake up and start running with Kaoru, the boy would get tired quickly and immediately ask the girl if they could stop training, since they would get stamina from leveling up anyway. She tried to explain to him that it was going to be more difficult to level up from level 4 onwards, but he interrupted her, saying that he could do more training once he leveled up. Her eyes narrowed at the sound of these words, hearing him groan in frustration and exhaustion, telling Kaoru that he worked hard to get into that school, and wondered why he had to go through more effort. Kaoru believed that it was amazing to get into adventurer's school, but if Sota tried to argue against upperclassmen like this, the school wouldn't take it lightly. She knew that Sota must be thinking that she would apologize and say that she would match his pace, but it has always been like this. The girl believed that Sota became like this because of her to some extent, but she should change the way she thought. If that's the case, then she was going to start distancing herself from him, proceeding to tell him that she would leave him behind as she started to run forward. The sounds of Sota's shouting could be heard, and all Kaoru could do was hold her head down with a disappointed frown, believing she couldn't do anything to fix the boy. Back to the present day, Kaoru stood up from her seat and glanced back in the direction of where Yuma stood, thinking about how she wished Sota had some guts like the red-haired male did. Our protagonist just sat at his desk and looked through his papers in silence, until someone interrupted his piece, that person being Kaoru, who looked down at him with furrowed eyebrows in confusion, as she asked what was up with him that day. He didn't know how to respond because he thought that she hated him, to which the girl crossed her arms and became even more confused, as she asked why he wouldn't say anything. Sota started to stutter, thinking up something to say, as he told Kaoru a lie about how he remembered something that he needed to do that day. The girl hummed and thawed at the apology and excuse, turning her body to walk away while reluctantly accepting that. It had been 2 weeks since the training started, and Sota had shown no signs of doing it. Since Sota himself didn't seem motivated at all, she thought it was about time that they stopped the training, since she felt as though she was only continuing it because she had promised his parents. Kaoru thought it was pointless, since all the love she had for him was completely gone anyway, the priority on her mind being that she needed to level up as fast as possible. She didn't have any free time to hang out with Sota, and in order to change her life for the better, she needed to solve her biggest and most difficult problem as soon as possible. The reason she and Sota were fiancés was because of a written magical marriage contract, and as long as that existed, she couldn't shake off this fact. Kaoru believed that he would lust for her body sooner or later, and could even order her to do indecent things. So before that happened, she needed to void the marriage contract as soon as possible. Glancing over at the red-haired male, it was time for things to progress in the story, and Sota found himself with his classmates and others in a dungeon. Sometime after the adventurer school, as a player, one would get to visit the heroine, Hayase Kaoru's house. As Sota was heading there, he had ended up stumbling at the general store, seeing as though things were normal in that place, but he wondered if he could really enter. The dark-haired boy felt reluctant to enter a house he didn't even know, even if it was technically his own home. But his thoughts were interrupted by the feeling of someone tapping at his shoulder, that person being his mother, who was surprised to already see him home. The male was surprised to see such a person along with his little sister, who was excited to see the boy, greeting him happily, and the wholesome sight made Sota start to tear up. He went up to his room and knew there would be no mistaking the fact that it was Narumi Sota's room. At least, it should be. Thinking about how filthy it was, he got this weird, nostalgic feeling from his room and family, but he pinned the reason on the work of Butao's mind. In other words, reminiscent of the two heroines' visuals, these two were Butao's family. This was information that wasn't in the game that he played, and this world was filling in the missing information, but the dark-haired male felt as though this could be bad. The advantage of him being a player seemed to be great, but there was now a chance of it all being completely useless, so he wanted to hurry and dive into a dungeon so he could test something. As he walked through the room, he was hit with another feeling, making him turn toward the clutter of garbage and things scattered across the ground. It felt too overwhelming and disgusting to just leave around, so Sota believed that his first priority was just to clean up for now, proceeding to find a vacuum while starting the chore. It felt weird since he didn't have any trouble with finding things and vaguely knew where everything was, making Butao's memories not be so much of a nuisance. It was possible that he could one day freely remember things as he wished, since he was also concerned with Kaoru's invitation earlier. Nevertheless, Sota found something when he was cleaning, and realized it was a magical contract for him and Kaoru, but it looked more like a kid's scribbles. He tried to focus on Butao's memories, hoping it could give him some sort of context, before he saw a flash of Sota writing the contract with Kaoru sitting next to the boy. It only happened for a split second, but he was glad to have felt the feeling, seeing as though this contract was important to him. Now that he was done with cleaning, he believed it was time to go to the dungeons, grabbing a tracksuit and a bat for him to fight with. He entered the buildings and told the clerk that he wanted to sign up, but it seemed as though the lady took one look at him and didn't seem to be content with his appearance. However, she still allowed it and asked if he had identification. Once she saw the wristband, the lady immediately knew he was from the adventurer school, changing her attitude and being more respectful. Sota was sure that the clerk was looking at him in disappointment and disbelief that a guy like him was going to the dungeon, but he was going to dismiss the thought as he continued towards the dungeons. Sota glanced around and inspected the area, waiting in line before he would eventually make his way to the large black void that he would walk through, eventually finding himself passing through and entering the dungeon. It was interesting to see what it felt like to pass through the barrier between the world and the dungeon, but it almost seemed like a tourist area where he stood, so he wanted to go deeper. Sota progressed quite a bit, and felt as though he found a place where there were fewer people after coming so far, but he was interrupted by the feeling of something forming behind him. The thing that formed was a slime, which should be an easy monster, making Sota smile at the sight of it, as he prepared his bat and immediately swung at the creature. It exploded and a crystal flew out, bouncing on the ground as Sota tried to catch his breath while smiling. He sat down on the ground and was happy to experience his first real dungeon, and his first dungeon subjugation, blushing in awe when this really confirmed he was in fact in the world of Dunx. Even so, the rate in the early levels was bad, but there was also something he wanted to test out. Everything seemed a bit familiar to him, as if he were looking at a map, but he eventually found the slime room that he recognized. In this room, slimes could merge together and grow, so this was a great place to grind. When he found a slime, it was scared by Sota's presence, and the fact that the boy swung at it even if it was an intentional miss. With that, Sota tried to run away in order to lure it, but that was what Sota wanted, seeing other slimes starting to combine with that one and becoming a bigger and stronger force. The dark-haired male ran forward and swung his bat again, destroying the slime monster with ease. As a Dunx player, he was going to let himself follow his instinct, thinking as though he could get through anything if he just kept swinging his bat. Finally, he looked above and saw his level increase to 2, causing the male to take a break and sit back down on the rocky ground with relief. He was glad to have finally leveled up, but he felt a sudden feeling coursing through his body, making Sota bewildered as he realized that was the feeling of raising his stats, which he thought he might get addicted to. Sota didn't want to brag, but he didn't feel the need to feel inferior in class anymore. But everything still felt weird to him. At the early stages, all players would use this slime room as hunting grounds, since it was easy to grind for levels, but it was so empty, which confused Sota greatly. Either way, he decided to not care about that for now, since he was able to enter there and it didn't seem as though this place was off limits, so it was perfect for experimenting. He started to stretch his body, and thought about how the concept of skills also existed in Dunx, but the basic thing about them was the fact that a person couldn't use their skills if they didn't raise their levels. However, there were 3 exceptions. The first was one used by the guys from Class D, Aura. The second was the power to produce a light source, Torch, and the last one was a small healing skill. Sota knew that he could only currently use those 3 skills, but he would usually use them by hitting a shortcut key or activating by moving his body, which were manual activations. There was little difference between the game and this world, and after trying out the manual activation of all these skills, it went surprisingly well. There was also something else that Sota wanted to try, thinking that it would be fine, so he glanced around the area to make sure no one was watching him. With that, the boy grabbed his bat and held it high in the air before calling out a phrase, Void/shock. Silence filled the air and it seemed as though nothing happened, which the boy expected, as he hadn't learned the skill. But what surprised him was the fact that a glowing light formed around his back, and a beam of light shot forward, bewildering him, while his body would be sent back a few feet from the force. Everyone in the other classes continued their own treks and journeys through the dungeon, and the long, dark-haired male that barged into Class E from earlier had seemingly been diving into dungeons ever since the first year of middle school at the age of 12. Even though his environment prepared him and the others for it, people are still risking their lives diving into these dungeons, and this man had seemingly only achieved the title of the second lowest in Class D, but he still tried to push forward with his egotistical attitude, thinking that there was nothing to be sad about as there was always Class E who was seemingly lower than him. A bunch of paramedics frantically ran past the male with a stretcher that held Sota's unconscious body on it, and the dark-haired male slowly opened his eyes and sat up on the bed, asking where he was. The nurse told him that he was in the guild's medical office, and explained that he had run out of magical power and was found unconscious around some slimes, causing him to blush and try to dismiss the story, and say that he had just gotten lost and tired, which led to such a situation. Sota had found himself awake the next day after entering the dungeon, and started to walk home in the evening while thinking about the previous day, knowing that he didn't want to tell the nurse the truth, along with the fact that he had activated a skill that he hadn't learned, which he thought would have made him look crazy in the head. As he continued his trek back home, Sota remembered that he currently had 4 debuffs: his body, being hated by one of the major characters in the original story, Butao's occasional memories coming back, and his low stats. But it seemed as though this world was trying to add a 5th debuff. When he returned, his family was quick to present dinner to him, making Sota realize just what happened to get that body of his to that weight. The boy apologized to his family and asked if they could start lowering his portions from now on, making them confused, since his mom said that she made his favorite, which made her ask what was the matter. Sota tried to explain that he wanted to go on a diet and have his food be more vegetable-focused, surprising his little sister, which made him sweat drop at the question. The boy said that ever since he entered adventurer school, he had to become more aware of his weight, and his father admitted that he did seem to be a bit chubby, but his sister tried to say he was perfect the way he was. After 1 month from that day, it was going to be the day of Karia and Yuma's duel, and the entirety of Class E was likely trembling in fear about this. Even if they were to pass the Karia event according to the story, everyone was still going to be preparing for a world-scale war, so Sota wanted to start preparing for all of that as well. He needed to level up so he could gather more information about this world, and the things that had been happening to him, such as his mysterious transport, becoming Butao, and any and all information he could get. In order to do that, this family was going to be a bit troublesome in his eyes, making him start to take notes about everything late in the night. Sota currently had no clue about how or why he was transported to this world, but the first thing he wanted to understand was why he was able to achieve an unlearned skill the previous day, since that shouldn't be possible. Being able to do something that he originally couldn't was a good thing, but he wondered if other people could do such things, and if he perhaps was the only one in the world. This could cause the story to be thrown into chaos, and if the story went against the one he knew, it was also going to be a problem for Sota. But his next priority was skill training, so he was going to head to the guild again, even if things seemed to be piling up. The next day, Sota was stopped by his mother if he was really fine to go that day with what happened yesterday, to which he tried to reassure her, until his little sister ran in and tried to ask to come with the boy, until the door was slammed on her promptly. He walked to the guild and bumped into someone, apologizing to them, until Sota realized it was the long-haired bully from earlier. This made Sota feel exhausted, since he didn't want to get too involved. But he was confused when the bully asked about the person behind Sota, making the dark-haired boy turn to see his little sister. The girl told the bully to apologize when bumping into someone, making the male glare. Sota told her to stop that, but he was quickly interrupted by the bully walking off with annoyance, and telling Sota to give his best for his class. The siblings took a breath of relief before arguing with each other about whether or not she should be there, making Sota feel how more bothersome things are becoming since he didn't want to show his skills to her, since he believed it would make her desires increase. With that, the boy said they could register together, but explained to her that those her age couldn't enter the dungeon. She seemed to be in thought and suddenly ran off with a wave, so now it was time for Sota to go back to his plans at the library. The reason why he came here was mainly to search for why his skill activated, since the ways to cast a spell were by auto-casting by shortcut keys, or manual casting like he did last time. First, he was going to learn about auto-casting, opening a book and learning that it was a simple matter of praying. Continuing with the next topic, there seemed to be absolutely no information about manual casting. It seemed that using skills not already learned wasn't the default in the world, so Sota believed that he was the only one in the world to be able to do this at that moment, making him wonder if he could switch places with Yuma, but he felt he couldn't do that. Sota didn't understand anything about this world, but he was able to notice that there were more students from his school at the library than normal, his thoughts being interrupted by the bully once again walking up to him. The male looked at the books in front of Sota, and assumed that he didn't already know how to cast his skills, saying that learning this would make him finally defeat a slime. But those very words confused Sota greatly. Outside of the guild, it seemed as though Sota's sister was squatting on the ground until she overheard students talking about how Sota was supposedly defeated by a slime, and were confused about how he got into the school in the first place, making the girl walk up to ask more about the story. Back at the library, Sota asked what the bully was talking about, until the male explained that it had apparently been known to everyone that Sota was carried away from a floor that only had slimes. The boy started to feel the life drain out of him when he heard that was what it looked like, but the male interrupted his thoughts and asked if he needed protection. However, Sota knew that this just meant they needed someone to carry their stuff. In the end, it seemed that there were only a few gophers in Class D, so Sota tried to politely reject the offer, but this only caused the bully to try and use the aura ability. It seemed that it was only affecting him, but he couldn't win against this guy in the current state he was in, making the bully tell Sota that he was just a small fry from Class E, who wouldn't say no to their request since he was the weakest guy in the room and was nothing at this school. The dark-haired boy felt himself sinking deeper with each word, since he felt as though they were correct, agreeing that he was in fact nothing. The skill that he was so proud of in his head-mounted display were all none, and there was no place for him in this school, and they even wished for him to be gone, so it wouldn't be long until he disappeared from class. People started to gather around when they heard what the bully said, laughing and making fun of Sota, since this was just that kind of world, which he knew more than anyone else. Sota started to tear up and chuckle to himself, but the bully tried to shout at everyone to look at his crying form. But that was when his little sister ran up and told the bully to stay away from her brother. That was when Sota's eyes widened, being reminded of something that he could cling to in this world, a place for him. The little girl started to tremble in her small form, her fist on the chest of the bully, which made him pause with surprise before the girl tried to grab Sota and walk off. Sota could feel his sister shaking, but the moment was interrupted by the upperclassman pulling the little girl toward his face by the collar of her shirt, glaring at her while asking if she thought she could leave just like that. A vein of anger popped, and he explained that he and Sota were in the middle of something, but the boy's little sister stood her ground, despite the anxiety that was likely coursing through her body. Sota tried to get his sister to apologize, seeing his upperclassman use the aura ability on both siblings, but Sota's little sister still stood her ground despite the tears forming in her eyes. The bully kept getting angrier and raised his fist, about to punch the girl, which Sota noticed. He started to frantically apologize, and said that he was going to get his sister to apologize too, shouting at the girl and seeing more tears fall down her face. In that moment, it was as if something struck within the boy, and he felt his body move forward on its own, dashing forward at the bully, ramming his body into the stomach of the upperclassman. The dark-haired boy realized what had happened and started to freak out, chanting in his head about how worried he was since he knew his actions were not his own. They were from Butao's feelings. The bully scoffed at the situation, and felt angry that both of the siblings were trying to oppose him, proceeding to grab Sota by his tie, which made the boy squeak in surprise and fear. People in the background continued to whisper amongst themselves, but Sota was starting to think for himself again when he remembered the moment that his sister walked in to protect him. Even if it was partly out of Butao's feelings, his next action was still out of free will, gripping onto the bully's arm and attempting to cast aura himself, telling the other male to let go of him, while insulting him about his weight. Unfortunately, the spell was not cast, and the bully was about to proceed with likely punching Sota until someone interrupted and split the two males apart, telling them they had both done enough. The woman in armor asked if she could fight in Sota's stead, making the two of them confused and standing in silence, until Sota realized he recognized the person. The bully sweat dropped and asked the woman why she wanted to do so, calling out her rank and class, which were both high in status, referring to her as Tenma Akira. The armored woman hummed and thought and said that she couldn't tell the details of why she wanted to do that, but she did explain that she wanted everyone to get along, because both of them were her colleagues. With that, she excitedly asked if the two of them could do so, making the bully stay silent. Sota turned toward the other male and saw him standing there with a reluctant face and glare, deciding to agree even when it was obvious that he didn't want to, telling Sota that he was going to remember this moment before walking away intimidatingly. Akira let out a sigh of relief at how scary the situation seemed, but Sota was more focused on remembering the character of who this woman was. As someone strong who ranks second in her grade, she was a beautiful girl who wore full metal due to the supposedly fat and ugly body of hers that she was cursed with. She turned towards Sota and brought him out of his thoughts, surprising him until the woman seemed to give a thumbs up to the boy, telling him he did a good job of hanging in there, along with his little sister. With that, the girl promptly ran off, and was going to apparently shake off the people from her own family, leaving Sota alone to collapse to his knees from all the stress. He was suddenly tackled by his little sister, who was crying loudly, thanking him for standing up for her when she did the same, but he wanted to thank her as well, until he realized everyone in the library was staring at them. Due to how awkward that seemed to be, he thought it would be better for them to go somewhere else, to which his little sister agreed. The sun shone through the clouds of the day and the two went outside the guild, sitting on a nearby bench while talking with each other. Sota was confused about the fact that the girl had returned so fast, after he told her that she should go try registering into the guild if she wanted to go dungeon exploring so badly. But his little sister was simple in her response, just saying she didn't want to go to the guild in the first place. The dark-haired boy was struck with confusion, while the girl explained that she knew from the start that middle schoolers weren't allowed inside the dungeon, but she wanted to do so in the first place because she wanted to be an adventurer as well, proceeding to punch at the air to emphasize her desire. Sota stared at the girl with surprise and paused for a moment, before getting confused at the fact that she was so stubborn in the first place, to which his little sister groaned in frustration and embarrassment, while admitting that she just wanted some attention, since her older brother was cold to her ever since the entrance ceremony, and even stopped calling her name. She felt even worse with the fact that she lied in the first place, apologizing to her brother, which made the boy feel something within him want to do something to turn that frown upside down. He dismissed the feeling and thought about how he knew it was Butao's feelings that made him jump in like that, knowing that the character seemed to care so much for his little sister. Sota wondered if Butao was actually a decent guy, and thought about it some more, starting to feel a little bad for borrowing his body like that. With that, he apologized to the girl, and said he was going to pay more attention to her from then on, calling her by her name Kano, also telling her to not do anything dangerous. He wondered if that was how Butao would act, and it seemed to be the right call since Kano smiled and agreed to his words, telling the boy they should go home together. Sota looked at her with an incredulous expression and told the girl to go home first, since he could enter dungeons now, and he wanted to grind his levels that day. After a while, night came, and Sota returned home with injuries once again, worrying his parents greatly as they checked in on him. He reassured that he was fine, and his mother clasped her hands together, explaining how Kano was sulking, which made him turn to the girl who seemed to be muttering to herself while seemingly depressed about the fact that she couldn't join him in the dungeon. As he tried to talk to her, the girl just shook her head until he told her that he promised that he would take her there someday. That was all it took to make Kano sprint toward him with excitement, until he told her that it would be inevitable if she was aiming for adventurer school, making the girl frown before they would eventually have dinner together. Later, at some point, Sota had found the bully from earlier and groveled at his feet, confusing him greatly. Because of a certain reason, Classy received inhospitality inside the school, and that performance not long ago was part of it, seeing as some people even quit because of it. It was all for nothing when the second rank stepped in, but the real problem was the fact that Sota rebelled in that kind of place. The boy continued to grovel, but the other male told Sota to shut up, as his voice was too loud. He didn't have any ill intent, but he wasn't going to defy, as that was the image he wanted to give. With that, the bully told Sota that they should go somewhere else, to which the boy agreed. Sota's goal wasn't to have a good isekai life. His first goal was to investigate what was going on, since his wish was to return to his previous world, and his other goal was to give someone like him a place, wanting to protect this family and maybe even repay Butao. Starting Monday, school was going to properly start, so his short-term goal was to level up, as he would be able to do more things. In all the events that come, he wanted the power to protect himself and his family. So that was why he didn't want events that weren't in the game to happen. When it was time to go back to school, it seemed as though a certain person walked up to knock on the door of the family, to which Kano let Sota know. The girl didn't describe the person or name who they were, so the dark-haired boy was confused until he walked to open the front door, being shocked when he realized it was Kaoru at the door. It seems Sota would find himself in the same party as Kaoru and Yuma. But how did he get into this position? After Kaoru walked to the boy's house, Sota would try to look through Butao's memories and realize that before entering school, it seemed that he and Kaoru exchanged a mysterious promise to go to school together, and that was what was happening at that moment. He walked a few feet behind the girl and none of them exchanged any words, which made Sota feel awkward with how the situation was, but he knew that it was Kaoru who hated this silence the most, but seemed to want to stay faithful to him. Sota wondered if Butao would be the one to actually talk more, deciding that he was going to do so, which made him try to think of a common topic, but his thoughts were interrupted by seeing the girl abruptly stop in her tracks. Without turning around, Kaoru said that she heard that he was defeated by a slime, proceeding to start walking again, while Sota would be left there to complain about the bully from earlier spreading rumors around. She stopped again and actually turned this time, apologizing, before explaining that she and Yuma had already formed a party, so she wanted to tell the boy why she couldn't join his own party, thinking that was likely what was on Sota's mind due to their previous closeness. The dark-haired boy could feel something course through his body, surprising him, but it was starting to become normal to expect, since it was Butao reacting negatively to the news. Sota remembered that Kaoru in the story would join Yuma's party early on and work together to save the world, already seeming close to the boy to call him by his first name. So our protagonist started to feel bad about Sota. As Sota walked to school, he saw that things were still progressing like the game, so he was glad that things were still convenient for him. But that was when he walked into class and heard someone groan about his presence. He turned with confusion to the class and had someone walk to him, mentioning that he heard Sota was beaten by a slime. But then everyone else started to gossip and chuckle amongst themselves about this, which started to make Sota get angry about all these insults. Kaoru was about to say something about the words until Yuma jumped in, telling everyone to not say such things, apologizing to Sota, while explaining that everyone was just nervous because of what happened on Friday, including him. The dark-haired boy glanced up at this male, remembering that the player would normally be placed inside Yuma in order to play the game through his consciousness. But it was the other way around now, so if Sota approached him carelessly, he was going to say something different from the story just like now. As he thought about being careful, the class continued to whisper amongst themselves and kept throwing insults. However, Yuma told Sota to not take them seriously. Sota remembered that he wasn't supposed to be called Butao at this point in time, wondering if it was because Yuma intervened. But this still didn't change the fact that he felt really out of place. Class started and the teacher reminded everyone that they were going to need to be in groups in order to dive into dungeons, so he was going to make everyone introduce themselves again, which Sota seemed to enjoy the idea of. For the idea of who to start with, the teacher was going to go by grades, and started with Yuma, who stood up from his chair, and explained that he was from Tokyo and used a one-handed sword. Kaoru was next in the introduction, and everyone continued down the line until Sota realized how things felt bad at that point, since he hadn't said anything that day besides, yeah. He was trying to keep a low profile in order to not hinder the story, but he needed to be more approachable to form a party, more cheerful. When it was finally Sota's time to introduce himself, he shouted his name, putting his fists over one another, starting to swing at the air to simulate swinging a bat, which he said was a weapon. The dark-haired male said that he was an aspiring priest, and raised his hand in a peace sign, holding it over his face. In that moment, Sota froze up and realized that that didn't look great at all, and the classroom was silent while Kaoru would sit at her desk with her hands over her face to hide herself from the second-hand embarrassment. With that, the teacher told everyone that they would be moving to orientation, and told everyone that they would use the facilities around the guild even after they graduated. The students walked out of the classroom and started talking to each other to try to make teams already, while Sota would be left there, still in his original pose, as he felt there was no going back from that. With a tightened fist, he tried to convince himself that going solo wasn't that bad. After trying to catch up with the other students, the teacher brought them to an arena that people would use to train their spells and adjust to their strength, leading them to a medical office that would heal them from injuries if needed. The last thing that the teacher told everyone was that they should bring company when on the first few floors, even if everyone had already dove into dungeons, telling everyone to make groups of 3 to 5 people, which made Sota want to kill the teacher right there. As the teacher explained, it was for formalities. He told everyone to gather in front of the guild in an hour, walking off before the students would glance around and immediately start talking with each other, trying desperately to make teams. It seemed Sota realized he wasn't the only one who was worried, since everyone else also wanted to hurry and form a party to level up, so he was going to do his best. Sota tried to go around to different people who all either laughed at his offer, weren't interested, or had a full party. He felt disappointed that he couldn't find anyone, but it seemed as though everyone made parties based on relationships, and wouldn't want to hang out with a failure like him. Sota looked up and saw some girls talking to Yuma, thinking that he already made his party, until Sota was surprised to see him seemingly decline the offer. That was when Sota got confused as Yuma ran up to the boy with a happy wave, asking if he wanted to team up with them. The dark-haired boy almost couldn't believe the confusion and wondered if the question was a death spell or such, wanting Yuma to stop joking around, as he didn't want the story to be in shambles if he kept interacting with Yuma. The only reason he was still alive in this world was because of the knowledge, so if Yuma's actions changed and done X, then Sota was going to have nothing left in this world. Sota was going to politely decline, but he wondered if he had a reason to refuse, and wanted to use Kaoru as an excuse. However, Kaoru wouldn't be happy if he did that. He saw the girl glance over and knew that she was supposed to team up with Kaoru, seeing her run toward their direction, which made Sota hope that she would take Yuma away from him. But his worst nightmare happened, and it seemed as though the girl asked if she could join the party. And that was how we got to the situation. Sota walked behind the two who chatted with each other, wondering why he was in this group when Kaoru was against such an idea of doing things with him. He wondered if he could ask about Yuma's situation, and was trying to get his attention, until Kaoru gave an empty expression in his direction which simulated the want for Sota to not do anything stupid with Yuma, making the boy shut up. In reality, Butao would get jealous of Yuma and start attacking, so Kaoru was in the right to stop him. But this wasn't the real Butao. That was when Yuma spoke up himself and asked Sota if he was trying to say something, causing Sota to remember they weren't complete strangers. But he knew Kaoru was being wary, so he just simply asked why Yuma wanted to be an adventurer in the first place. The red-haired boy hummed and thought and just gave a simple answer that it was admiration, as he saw adventurers when he was a youngster on TV and such, laughing and apologizing that it wasn't a proper answer in his eyes. Sota sat there with surprise, remembering that Yuma was originally just a vessel for the players. But Yuma in this world was different. He had his own motives, still standing his ground in scary situations while also being a mere high school freshman. Sota didn't want to just support the character, but he also wanted to support Yuma as a human, speaking up and saying that what Yuma said was very admirable. Kaoru looked at Sota with bewilderment and confusion, making Sota realize that was out of character, as Yuma tried to be humble about it, but there was no going back from that as well. As they reached the second floor, the teacher told everyone they could do whatever with their party now, and to not be late for class the next day, dismissing them all for the day as Sota was about to walk off to rent a weapon, until Yuma stopped him. The red-haired male explained that he and his party were going to dive into the third floor at that point, making Yuma want to know if it was alright for Sota to join his party again. A couple of days ago at the Hayase Pavilion, Kaoru could be seen in the bath, trying to relax and let out all the stresses that had been on her mind lately. But it didn't seem to do much as she got out of the bath and promptly got dressed with a towel in her hair. She realized that she had gotten a notification, and saw the news that Sota had been supposedly defeated by a slime. So that was why Kaoru decided she wanted to go to the Narumi household. The girl rang the doorbell and saw Kano open the front door, seeing the little girl frown at the sight of Kaoru, who greeted Sota's little sister. Kaoru tried to be polite, and heard the news about Sota being hospitalized, only to be interrupted by Kano saying that Sota was fine. But Kaoru couldn't help but be worried and ask if the boy was injured, getting interrupted again by Kano, who insisted he was fine. The girl ran off and shouted at Sota to let him know that that person was here again, making Kaoru seem bewildered. But this was to be expected since Kaoru had been acting cold towards Sota since spring break, so it was natural for Kano to act in such a way. When Sota walked to the door, he was struck with confusion when he saw Kaoru at the door, watching as the girl greeted him reluctantly. She really wanted to cancel the magical marriage contract, and Kaoru felt as though it would be bad for both of them if they were soft on each other again, thinking about what would happen if she were blunt about it and told him she wanted to cancel it. But the girl felt as though being straight to him would cause Sota to be stubborn. Due to that, Kaoru remembered their promise to walk to school together, and thought that she would turn things around, telling him that they needed to go now even if he wasn't finished with breakfast. As they walked together, Kaoru would subtly glance at the boy behind her, thinking about how weird Sota had been ever since the entrance ceremony, almost as if he was acting with uncertainty. As they walked together, Kaoru would subtly glance at the boy behind her, thinking about how weirdly Sota had been acting ever since the entrance ceremony. Usually at the start of a holiday, Butao would be up in Kaoru's business and cling to the girl's presence, demanding to know why she wouldn't answer his calls, which she would respond with the excuse of studying. he would turn it around and ask if studying was more important than her childhood friend, to which the girl would cover up her chest when she realized he was staring. While saying it wasn't like that, Kaoru was surprised to see that the boy had stopped calling persistently and he wouldn't stare at her chest anymore, wondering if people changed that easily, or if the dark-haired boy was just not interested in her anymore. With that question in mind, she was going to test it by mentioning his defeat by a slime before explaining that she and Yuma were in a party together, tightening her fist before turning around when she expected the boy to get angry. But Sota just responded with a cheer and said that it was reassuring that she had Yuma by her side. Kaoru knew that Sota wasn't a person who could hide his feelings well, so she wondered if he really wasn't interested in her anymore, knowing that she should be happy with such a thing, but it felt weird. As they walked into class together, Sota was approached by a student who mentioned the rumors, and everyone started to gossip and insult the boy, and Kaoru would just stand there and listen to their words. But she felt as though she needed to do something since they were childhood friends. She was about to speak up until Yuma did so himself, walking up and being friendly with Sota, which surprised the girl, since she had been wanting to team up with someone like him ever since the day he stood up to Karia. But Kaoru remembered the magical contract she had with Sota, and how she had faint memories of its contents along with the penalties. As the girl was looking at the rental weapons of the guild, she was approached by Yuma, and already asked about forming a party together, making her confused, until he explained that she was the first one to raise her voice against Class D. Despite the contract, there was no penalty. It wasn't as if she hated Sota, but she believed that she could concentrate better without him there. There were two other people who joined the team with Kaoru and Yuma, and those people were Tachigi Naoto and Sanjoi Sakuranko from earlier, who would provide support ranged attacks and healing. They needed to level up and gain strength, since Yuma's battle against Karia was in 1 month, and Karia's level was likely over 10. Levels would enhance one's strength and help them choose a job. Everyone was currently jobless, so they needed to hurry and choose one with their little time. But Kaoru felt as though she could do it with these people, along with the fact that they had a secret weapon. When she joined Yuma and Sota, she wanted to join more to be with Yuma rather than Sota, walking through the dungeon while trying to make conversation with the red-haired boy. The girl tried to talk about the improvements they could make, and it seemed as though Yuma was going to answer until he suddenly changed the topic, which confused the girl, until she realized that he was likely letting Sota know about their current condition, being considerate to the boy who was supposedly defeated by a slime. Yuma turned to Sota and asked what he was trying to say just now, surprising Kaoru with the direct question, as she glanced at the dark-haired boy and hoped that he wouldn't say anything weird, to which Sota asked why Yuma wanted to be an adventurer in the first place. The red-haired boy hummed and thought and simply answered it was admiration, and Kaoru wanted to say something as well, thinking that she agreed it was her motivation too, but she knew that the truth was that her main reason was wanting to distance herself from Sota. However, saying the truth would be rude. After this first run-through of the dungeon, Yuma had teamed back up with his original party from earlier, and told everyone that there was someone that he wanted to invite to the party, asking what everyone thought, but Kaoru knew that he meant Sota. Naoto fixed the glasses that sat on his face and said he wanted to honor Yuma's decision, but he felt hesitant about welcoming the guy who was supposedly defeated by just a slime, wondering what their classmates would think of them, along with what Sota would think about such an offer. Yuma realized that Sota's thoughts were important, affirming his awareness of that fact while explaining that he would think about that after trying to invite the dark-haired boy, saying that he just wanted the others to help the boy out, since everything didn't matter as long as they could defeat Karia. If Yuma asked how Kaoru felt, she would say she hated the idea, but she didn't want to talk about her relationship with Sota, along with the fact that Sota now likely lost interest in her and was going to trust Yuma, since there was no reason for Sota to turn down the offer. However, Sota did as so and asked why Yuma wanted someone like him, causing surprise in both Kaoru and Yuma, before the red-haired boy said it was simply because Sota complimented him after driving away Class D, and the fact that Sota told Yuma that his answer was a good one. Yuma tried to continue, but Sota interrupted, and said that the first thing he needed to do was fight Karia, and not add a dead weight like him, asking if he was trying to win the teacher's approval. Sota asked again why Yuma invited him to his party, and explained that he would just be miserable and stand out, surprising Kaoru even more as she watched the boy slap away Yuma's hand, walking away. He used to be able to say those kinds of things easily, but Kaoru realized that the boy had changed, and she wondered if she was the problem instead, and if Sota meddling with Yuma was just her misunderstanding, making Kaoru believe that she might have possibly been looking down on Sota. From now on, Sota was planning to go through the dungeons all alone, since he knew that he couldn't mess with or get close to any of the main characters, since he needed the storyline to be as close to the original as possible. As he tried to train himself with a new weapon that was likely rented, Sota was blasted away by the force of an attack from another enemy, causing the dark-haired boy to collapse and roll onto the ground. But he was able to pick himself up while panting heavily, holding his staff forward with a focused look. Sota stood opposite the monster in front of him, which had its jaw hung low, as it walked on all fours towards Sota, who charged forward with his staff. But it seemed as though the monster wanted to attack as well, which made the dark-haired boy barely able to dodge the punch before aligning his body back to the ground, using his entire body to put all of his weight and force into the swing, hitting the head of the creature with a large blow. It exploded into a puff of smoke, and Sota landed on the ground before looking above him, realizing he had increased to level 4, looking forward to witness the magic stone fall to the ground after the monster had dissipated. It was 1 week after the boy had transported to the world of Dunx, and he was now level 4, deciding to dive solo in the end since it was better if he would try to stay away from the main objectives. It was a good place to stop, but since he was level 4, Sota wanted to try and go down to the 5th floor to see how much further he could get on his own. As he started to walk down the long, spiraling flight of stairs that led to the next floor, Sota tightened his fist in front of him, and was bewildered by the fact he was finally level 4. But he knew that things weren't going to be so easy anymore after this. He was going to the 5th floor, since reaching level 4 meant that increasing one's level would become drastically harder, and because of that, this became the bare minimum to become a professional adventurer with a job. But that was just the setting. Following that setting in Dunx, there were several gimmicks prepared, and as Sota walked to his next destination, he was going to prepare for one of them, which involved a bridge. He stared down to the bottom of the pit and knew that anything would die if they fell off. But he needed this bridge and pit since he was going to set up a trap to gain more levels. First, one would go across the bridge and gain the orc's hatred. Hatred being a monster's hostility toward a person, and you would wait for the orc to use his war cry skill, causing its friends to come after you. After that, you should be careful to not let them catch you. Then, cross the bridge and cut the rope, causing the bridge to collapse. The fall damage that the orcs would receive would count as a person defeating them, so this was a technique one could use to get a huge amount of experience. Sota opened up his status window to check on his level and stats before deciding that he wouldn't do the trick that day as it was getting late, and he would just check on the bridge for now, knowing that he would be looking forward to the next day. He realized that there was another bridge as he walked down the halls of the dungeon, and thought about how excellent this gimmick was, knowing that it was what he was going to be mainly aiming for now. But that was when he noticed something in the distance and ran toward that certain thing. Sota stood there while staring at the pillar, which had a symbol on it, something that Sota knew was a gate. If it was like the game, then it should connect with the location of the adventurer's school, and if he used it, he could add 4 hours of hunting for each trip. As a student, Sota should be grateful for this, but he felt weird, since he glanced around his surroundings and realized he didn't see anyone else using this gate. It wasn't also just at this area on floor 5, but it was also the same for the slime room on floor 1, where he didn't see anyone else. The same went for the best hunting places on floors 2 and 3, and all of these places were completely empty. These places could be really helpful for players like him, but he decided that he was just going to focus on trying to test out the gate, activating it like he usually would in the game. With that, Sota raised his hand and placed it on the pillar, thinking about just using auto-casting, which made him feel as though a gust of wind blew past him. A grid appeared around the room, and the dark-haired male glanced around the room he was in, knowing that he'd activated it, before he finally decided to use the pillar, focusing his energy on the hand that was on the pillar while feeling the energy of the pillar itself starting to radiate off of it. The boy looked up and saw that the area started to change around him, until eventually it landed him in an empty area with windows and chalkboard. It seemed to be an unused classroom, and Sota left the room to see the stone walls of the hallways, walking up the stairs and finding himself in an area that felt familiar to him, as the coordinates that he was sent to were the same as in the game, the basement of the adventurer's school. Since it was a day off, there were few people there, so Sota planned to go home before anyone would notice him. But unfortunately, things had to go differently, as the teacher of his class walked up behind him and asked what he was doing there. When Sota realized that the teacher had caught him there, he froze in place and slowly turned around to face the taller male, as he asked him what he was doing there at this time and on a day off. Sota repeated the question in his head and wondered if the teacher was unaware of the gate, confused as to why he was asking such a question while seeing the suspicious glare in his eyes. The dark-haired boy thought it could also be a question due to the teacher's doubt that someone like Sota could go to floor 5, but the boy still tried to feign ignorance and put up a sheepish expression, saying that he had supposedly remembered that he forgot something on Friday, and was thinking of getting it on his way home from the dungeon, but that he had lost track of time. Sota paused for a moment and hoped the lie worked. sweat dropping until the teacher hummed at the answer and turned around, telling the boy to be more careful. With that response, Sota was able to confirm that the gate was really unknown to the public, because if it was, Mudai wouldn't have asked what he was doing there. There was also a chance that the teacher knew about the gates and just turned a blind eye, but at the very least, he was going to assume that everyone knew about the gates in order to make him seem less suspicious in the future. It was a shame, but he was going to have to use the regular route for the next day. That very next day, Sota made his way down to the bridge he found earlier, and was excited to finally be able to use the bridge trap on all of the orcs, grinding for some experience points and increasing his levels. The dark-haired boy lightly stomped on the edge of the bridge, testing the strength of it, making sure he wouldn't plunge to his death, slowly walking across the bridge before making his way back to pick up his weapon and returning to the other side. Sota wiped the sweat off his forehead, and internally let out a sigh of relief that the bridge didn't break. But now the real part of the plan began. Turning around the corner while thinking about how orcs were sluggish but had high attack power, so he needed to be careful. However, when Sota turned the corner to where it would eventually lead to the orcs, he found a male hunched over on the ground, clutching at his stomach while groaning. That man weakly asked for help, and Sota ran up to ask if he was alright. However, the man in glasses cared more about the state of his friend, reaching out to clutch onto Sota's clothes as he begged him for help. With that, Sota looked ahead of the man and saw another person collapsed on the ground, but he could also see the horde of orcs who were all crowding around what was likely now the corpse of one of their party members. He stared with shock and was almost frozen in place, feeling his body shake from the horrific scene, until he felt himself charge forward and attempt to hit at one of the orcs. When he slammed the weapon down on the backs of the orcs, he immediately turned around, hoping that luring them would make a difference in the situation, telling the male with glasses to bear with him for a moment as he was picked up in Sota's arms and run off with. The horde of orcs started to chase after Sota, who had tears in his eyes from the stress of the situation, hearing them roar loudly as he ran to the start of the wooden bridge, placing the man with glasses on the ground as the orcs ran outside the entrance of their nest. With that, Sota started to run across the bridge with the horde only focused on him, to which Sota reached the other side and tossed his staff to the side, before desperately taking out a dagger to slice at the rope of one of the sides of the bridge. The orcs kept running wildly toward his direction, which made him worried, as he finally sliced through it, about to slice through the rope of the other side. But that was when Sota saw how close the orcs were, and how they were only inches away from his face, which meant he had no time left. Suddenly the bridge collapsed, and the orcs started to fall down into the pit with a roar, falling into the void of wherever that pit ended, eventually leading to their deaths. Sota collapsed to the ground with a sweat, and realized that the man with glasses had pulled out his own knife and sliced at the rope at the other end despite a broken limb and exhausted body. After a while, the paramedics came to rescue the man in glasses and remnants of his party, but he asked the paramedics if Sota was still there as he wanted to thank him for saving him. But it seemed as though he had already left, even though the paramedics wanted to hear some statements from him as well. When Sota finally ran home with a heavy breath, he later checked on the guild to confirm that all 6 of the party members were injured, while 2 of the 6 were confirmed dead. People had died, and Sota had to witness it, even if it wasn't his fault, but it was starting to make him wonder what was going on, since he was the only one who enjoyed this world, thinking about everything that had been going on that day and what he could have done better. However, that was when Kano walked up and asked if he was okay. He tried to reassure her that he was doing fine, the 2 sitting at the dinner table while Sota kept thinking about the bodies of those people, before asking his little sister if she would come with him if he told her to come with him into the dungeon, even if it was against the law. As the 2 sat in the kitchen and Sota asked such a question, Kano couldn't help but stare in confusion at the fact that Sota wanted to hear her thoughts about joining him to the dungeons despite the law. The boy wanted to know how she felt about a back door he knew into the dungeon, knowing that she had always wanted to go in, especially to fight alongside Sota, but she knew that Sota would get in trouble if they broke the rules and dove in despite her being underaged. That was when the dark-haired male explained that he would only get in trouble if they got caught, so since Kano was aiming to get into his school, he didn't think it was a bad thing to get stronger beforehand. He started to explain about a skill called Fake, a skill that would give one's opponent false information. So if she was going to dive in at the age that she's at now, she must learn that skill. The little girl wondered why he was going that far for her when he was originally against the idea in the first place. But this was a reasonable response coming from Kano, so he asked her if she remembered what happened in the library the previous week, when she stood up for him against his upperclassman bully. The male explained that each year, students from the outside were treated like that, and others would even act violently. So at a time like that, Sota wanted Kano to be able to defend herself, tightening his fist in front of him as emphasis, before he saw his little sister nod her head in affirmation. With that, the girl smiled despite her worries, and decided that she would agree with going. But Sota could see the excitement in her eyes and let out a sigh, feeling glad that the girl was happy even though half of what he said was a lie. As the story progresses in this world, there would be a route where a large number of characters would die, and of the characters who die, this did include the Narumi family, as they were nothing more than mob characters in the video game. This was why leveling up was a must, and people in this world needed to be relatively strong as well. So Sota, knowing what would happen in the story, was extremely important knowledge, but telling others such things carried risks. The male thought back on the memory of 2 of the members of that man's party being beaten relentlessly and eaten to death, but he knew that he couldn't be reluctant to bring his sister to the dungeon, as he wanted to protect the people dear to him, even if this was technically the family of a man whose body he was inhabiting. 1 week later, they were walking through the forest together, and Sota glanced back at the girl who asked if they were there yet, to which Sota asked if he told her they were going through the mountain, making Kano shake her head while denying such. The only reason why they were taking this route was because there were a couple of students who would be able to identify Kano, so he wanted to make sure she didn't get in trouble, glancing back and wondering if telling her about a certain thing would be okay. They reached the basement together, and entered the unused classroom before Sota would hold his hand over the chalkboard, activating the symbol to send him into the dungeon, letting them fight a few orcs on the way to the bridge. He explained the plan to her and told her to not chicken out, to which she seemed confident and nonchalant, while saying that it would be fine as she only had one job. With that, he walked across the bridge and thought about what happened the past week. The 2 of them had tried various things to make sure everything would go well at this moment, and his little sister ended up going with a machete while he chose scissors for the rope. Kano was casually sitting in wait only to start screaming with tears in her eyes at the sight of the horde while he told her to cut it, which she quickly got up for. She raised the machete and Sota was able to cut his side, but when Kano tried to do her side, it didn't work, and she froze up when she saw the orcs getting closer. Her brother charged forward and was able to cut the other side in time while being grazed on his arm before the orcs fell to their deaths. Kano apologized about his arm, but he reassured her that he was fine, as he was wearing a jacket made out of a demon wolf's pelt, so he apologized as well since it was her first time in such a scary situation. The girl grunted and squirmed when she felt a sudden feeling through her body, as Sota explained that was the symptoms of leveling up, and the girl felt as though she had gone through 5 levels, surprising the boy before he heard her mention something about a job change, which caused him to stop her right there. Sota explained that their starting class, newbie, actually had more to it than one would think, and that training hard enough could make people expand their levels by 3. However, one could only feel the difference later. The 2 sat there after Sota finished rambling about the system, as he realized he had spoken too much, since Kano would ask about any of the words he said since she wasn't aware of such things yet. Meanwhile, Yuma and his team had all finally reached level 5, and were able to change their jobs to the ones they were aspiring to be, with Kaoru as fighter and Yuma as thief, seeming happy in the moment, but their happiness could only last so long, as it was only 1 week until the match with Kariya. The day comes closer and closer to the time when Yuma and Kariya are to fight, to which the upperclassman male checks out the site of the arena during his days off. Meanwhile, Sota was taking a break with his sister in the dungeon, and Kano told her brother a warning to not tell anyone about the bridge trap, explaining that it would be a shame if other people started using this hunting spot, or if a bunch of scary guys supposedly came looking for information with threats. The dark-haired male sweat-dropped at the words and nodded, agreeing before tightening his fist as he paused for a moment. He glanced down at the ground and wondered if his reasoning for knowing such a place bothered her, making Kano hum in thought before affirming so, even if it was a bit unsure. So Sota just said he only found the area by chance. This was, of course, a lie, since Sota was the one who specifically sought out this place in order to grind for levels, but he couldn't help but be surprised by how much trust this girl had in Butao, making him feel odd about the whole situation. The boy thought back on everything that had happened, and how being enrolled in the adventurous school was amazing, but he acted cowardly back in the library. It was almost like Kano had this priority about things and then would replace them, making Sota feel as though something was off, and that it felt too frank to be an act. So he wondered if he could really trust his little sister. Meanwhile, in another part of the dungeon, Kaoru and the others were training, when Yuma was overpowering her attacks. The red-haired male charged forward with his blade, slashing at her, while she would collapse to the ground, the 2 of them panting heavily before Yuma would speak up and outstretch a hand toward Kaoru, saying that he was starting to get the feel for the sword fights. She gently placed her hand in his and was helped up, as Yuma told her that his increase in skill was all thanks to her, but she glanced away timidly and felt humble about it, downplaying his compliments, while explaining that she was just supposedly copying Kariya's battle record. He told her that he was grateful for her doing that, but Kaoru still couldn't help but feel anxious about this all, the grip on the handle of her blade tightening as she put a hand to her chest, and glanced up at the red-haired boy, asking Yuma if he thought he could win against Kariya. Yuma sweat-dropped and his expression turned into a conflicted one, filled with a little doubt and anxiety, saying that he wasn't going to lie about his answer, and responding he didn't really know if he could. With that answer, Kaoru stood there in silence, and the others jumped into the conversation, explaining that if Yuma felt as though his winning chances were low, withdrawing was an option, but Yuma interrupted everyone, insisting he couldn't withdraw. Even before the duel, Class E was considered lower than everyone in both level and experience compared to Class D, so this was Yuma's chance to overthrow the male on a whim. If he withdrew from the fight, then nothing was going to change, and the red-haired boy felt as though this would also give the upperclassmen a reason to call them cowards. However, this was also the reason Yuma didn't want to lose. Hopefully this would go well, considering Kariya, the man himself mentioned, was still training on his own, and was seen punching at multiple punching bags and tearing them into pieces while he was only just breaking a sweat. Sota and Kano went with each other to a shop after they had gotten a lot of money from all their dungeon hunting, and he had used a lot of the money to buy some boots for his little sister, in order to make sure that she would be a little more safe in the future. Everyone was doing their own thing as well as the days went by. The long, dark-haired bully from Class D was going through the dungeon with his own party and leveling up as much as they could, while Yuma and his team were all doing their own individual ways of training themselves. Kaoru choosing to just sit in the bath while stuck in thought. So many things were going on inside her head that she almost didn't hear the shout of Sota calling her name. Snapping back into reality and seeing that the boy had grabbed her and stopped her before she would walk into the street, while the light was still red. She hesitated and was bewildered before apologizing, and the dark-haired boy asked how Yuma was doing, to which the girl explained that they got to level 6 in 1 month, and that Yuma's motivation was high. Even with that, this fight was still going to be hard, as this duel was called Kariya's event, and most players in the game would die the first time around. It looked like Yuma's leveling went smoothly, but people can't wing it with just the levels alone. So for Yuma's level, at least one special weapon was going to be desirable, but even then it was a struggle. Everyone gathered themselves into the arena, and Kaoru was praying to herself, since she had been stressed about the fight the whole month. But Sota seemed to have some faith in Yuma winning this fight after all, seeing the red-haired boy pull out his blade for the battle. Yuma was sweating, and he was trying not to show the worry and anxiety that filled his body and his eyes, staring forward as Kariya called out Yuma's name, and asked if the boy was ready. The red-haired male threw the sheath of his blade away and affirmed that he would always be ready, and everyone in the school could be seen on the sidelines, watching from all angles of the arena. Kaoru still had her hands clasped together, showing how stressed and worried she was about the results, before overhearing the gossip coming from the upperclassmen students. They laughed and whispered to each other about how the lower classes seemed to not know their place, and these students didn't believe they were going to win against Kariya. Another student bewildered that those in Class E tried to defy them. The girl glanced over at these students before she and her party members heard the voice of the bully from earlier, making them look at the large male who walked in with confidence. He walked straight to Sakurako, which made the pink-haired girl look worried and upset, as the male put a hand around her body, greeting her with a sickeningly sweet voice, until Naoto grabbed the bully's hand and asked if he was sure he could loaf around the areas like he was. But the upperclassman student only glared as a response, muttering under his breath, before Naoto would turn his attention to the arena since the match was about to start. Kariya said that he was ready to start as well, and the announcer confirmed the start of the match. But it seemed as though everything went so fast, as Kariya already charged forward with his blade, surprising Yuma greatly. His eyes widened, and so did Kaoru's, as the red-haired boy had to jump back to dodge, causing Kariya to grin at the fear that seemed to coat the expression of Yuma. However, Yuma still was just getting started. That swing with a great sword was one that Sota's eyes couldn't see, but he still came a long way and was now level 8. With that said, if he fought Kariya himself, Sota wondered if he would have a higher chance of winning, but he immediately answered his own question with a no, since that was just how much of a gap in experience and level that those in Class D had compared to Class E. Kaoru and the other students of the school watched closely, and the girl thought about how they were all level 6, but all of their stamina and combat prowess were all different, so there could even be level 7 people who could be weaker than her, which meant that people could turn things around despite their levels. Even so, Kariya was level 11, with the kind of physique that he already had, causing both of them not to be able to afford any openings, and for the two of them to always be cautious. But this was where the secret weapon came in. As Kariya slashed at Yuma once again, he dashed back to dodge it once more, and looked up at the tall male, asking him what was up with him, as there was no power in his attacks, which made the red-haired male ask if Kariya was scared. The two males stepped toward each other, and Kariya asked the same, and Yuma agreed, saying they were just going to wear themselves out at this rate. He grinned and gripped his blade, a blade that Sota recognized as a static sword. This was a weapon that would be able to lower an opponent's agility and have a medium chance to paralyze people, making this a bothersome weapon to obtain. The two men stood opposite each other and prepared themselves to continue the battle, to which Yuma kneeled onto the ground before charging forward, which surprised Kadia a bit, as Yuma tried to slash at the taller male. Kadia had blocked the attack with his own blade, and the two men made eye contact with each other before clashing weapons with each other once again. The people watching from above talked with each other about their thoughts of the battle, wondering what Yuma was doing, and if the red-haired male was getting impatient, calling him lame. Even if this was what the upperclassmen thought, this static sword was something that Kadia didn't know, and Kaoru noticed how wary Kadia seemed to be, not wanting to pull off big moves. Meanwhile, Sota noticed that Kadia's favorite move was to endure all the attacks and then use a huge swing, watching that very thing happen as the larger male attempted to use a big swing again. Yuma was able to predict the attack, as it all seemed to be a pattern, and the red-haired male narrowed his eyes before waiting for the opening, and trying to activate the static sword's ability, the blade starting to glow as he announced that he would be taking the next attack. Yuma activated the skill of the blade, Double Sting, plunging the tip of it into a part of Kadia's chest. Earlier, the upperclassman bully that had been harassing Class E and Sota's family lately was thrown against one of the pillars of the school, letting out a grunt of pain. He wondered why he was acted towards that way and looked up at the woman who sat in what almost seemed to be like a throne, with other students standing behind her. This woman being known as Suo Kolki. Her legs were crossed over each other, and Kolki asked if the bully already knew about the situation that he caused, driving out Class E right after enrollment and using one of her students in his harassment. On top of that, she was disappointed that he would use her students, failing to find slaves. Kolki mentioned that the classes were all ranked in order from A to E, and this ranking was absolute, talking about the duel that Kadia was going to have with Class E, and how she had used her connections to free up the arena, so she hoped that Kadia was going to lose. The dark-haired girl was about to warn about what was going to happen if Kadia lost, but she glanced over at someone who interrupted her words and grabbed at her leg. This woman spoke up and insisted that Kadia wouldn't lose, saying that even a level 7 student like her couldn't even imagine fighting against a man like Kadia, and mentioning how that male would dive into disgusting places and would work unbelievably hard. Kolki glanced down at the girl and held a cold look in her gaze, before she would spin around and kick the girl in the side of her body. At the words that the girl would mention, Kolki repeated the words back, saying that the only way one could deny that was due to the caste system that was made in this school, and she looked to Kadia for his opinion on the situation. The short-haired male just stood there without saying a word, and the girl called out Kadia's name, yet he didn't respond, as she tried to ask if he thought that he wouldn't lose. Again, he didn't respond to the question, but finally opened his mouth, asking Kolki if she thought he could win, or if she thought he lacked the effort. The girl was confused by Kadia's questions, watching the tall male bow and apologize for the trouble he had caused. Kolki said that there was no need, and that the incident in the library was something that Kadia didn't seem to know about, saying that he still worked hard even if he would lose, but he won't make excuses, and just show the results of his actions. With that, Kadia told the woman that he was going to go back to training, excusing himself until Kolki asked if he wasn't going to help the female student that was still under the foot of Kolki. Kadia explained that he had only come there to apologize as the representative of Class D, proceeding to turn around and tell Kolki to do what she liked with the girl. With that, he walked away from the classroom, while hearing the pained grunts of the female student who begged for Kolki to stop. Back to the battle, Kadia was pierced with the static sword. However, even before the battle, he had known about the abilities of the static sword. Yuma panted heavily and chuckled to himself, saying that the skills of the sword would make him able to see Kadia's every movement. But he was quickly proven wrong by Kadia immediately kicking Yuma away. The upperclassman student grinned widely and asked what Yuma was talking about regarding his movement, seemingly putting an intimidating aura out. Because Kadia knew about the sword, he made countermeasures and changed his armor to have stun resistance. But even so, Kadia was cautious, since he believed that Yuma still had something up his sleeve. The red-haired boy slowly got back up, and his body started to tremble from the exhaustion, as Kadia looked down at the boy, and the battle continued while the students would watch. Everyone from Class E stared with shock and disbelief, staring with horror while Kaoru would collapse to the ground, as Yuma was starting to lose. He was being held up by his face in Kadia's hand, and the upperclassman asked if the red-haired male wanted to say something or if he was surrendering. Yuma was dropped to the ground with bruises and was bleeding from his nose, shouting that he wasn't surrendering, but that only had Kadia just kick him away once again, which made Yuma fly in a direction while grunting from the pain. In that same moment, Kadia charged forward and slashed the sword into Yuma's gut, looking down at the male who still tried to choke out that he wasn't surrendering. But Sakurako had had enough, and ran forward to shield the boy from any more attacks. The pink-haired girl told Kadia to stop and not hurt him anymore, seemingly causing the tall male to stop his actions. Naoto stared with shock and disbelief as the bully chuckled and asked if he should return his words to him. The teacher left the scene of the arena, and with that, due to being unable to fight back, Yuma lost, and the winner was Kariya. Kariya let out a breath while staring down with a glare at the red-haired male who was defeated in the battle, as Kaoru and Sota stared forward with either horror, disbelief, or bewilderment. The upperclassman stood there with his fists tight, as the students from the higher classes started to cheer in excitement. Sakurako sat there next to Yuma, trying to vaguely protect the last of the consciousness he may have left, while everyone from Class E would stare in shock or disappointment. Kaoru and Naoto ran out into the main area of the arena, calling out the name of Yuma, before Kariya would shout out loud to garner the attention of everyone in Class E, asking them if they understood now which classes were stronger and were above them, and who they should obey. The male continued, and said that some of the students may go up to Class D by the time they would graduate, but he had no faith in them, and just said they were all a bunch of slaves, and that he was giving all of them an order about how the upperclassmen wanted gophers. Koki sat up at her usual chair, watching through a screen with a grin, as she leaned her face against her fist. Kariya told everyone that if they had a problem with his words and orders, he would duel with all of them any time, just like he did with Yuma. The red-haired male groaned in his half-conscious state as the students from the higher status classes laughed with each other, saying how they knew that Class E was just all talk, proceeding to start walking away from the arena while saying that Class E's spirit was the only thing good about the class, telling them that they were going to work them to the bone as gophers and to prepare themselves. As Yuma and his party started to walk away, Kaoru and Naoto holding the red-haired boy up to support his body as he walked, Yuma apologized to everyone, calling himself weak, hanging his head low with an expression of regret. The other students stared with indescribable expressions, likely some with pity, before Yuma would realize how pathetic his form looked, and he took his arms off his party members to try and seem less weak, apologizing once again, saying he would win next time. The students continued to stare in silence, while Sota glanced at everyone and started to walk off, thinking about how he was expecting to at least feel a little vexed about the situation. He was going to hold a grudge, but as he went into the empty classroom to grab his school bag in order to walk home early, the dark-haired boy knew that the disparity against the other classes was not something he could manage himself. Sota felt sorry for Yuma, but this loss wasn't something too far off from the main story. However, this isn't something that he should be thinking about now, as the real problem that was on Sota's mind was about who gave Kariya the countermeasure to Static Sword. This really confused Sota, as the Static Sword was strong and usually extremely difficult to acquire, so people who lived in this world would usually not expect such a quality item to be used by someone of low status in the school. Kariya's armor was also different from the usual one he would wear in the game, and it wasn't as if Sota didn't think about such a possibility, but now he was convinced. There were other players aside from him in this world. Everyone either walked back to their classes, went to the nursing office, or just walked about for the rest of the day, while Sota continued to think about how someone in the hundreds of students in this school had told Yuma to get the Static Sword, and how someone had told Kariya about the countermeasures to said item. There could be a chance that Sota was overthinking things, but moving forward, he was going to act under the premise that other players could exist, especially given what happened that day. According to the story, crushing Yuma would just become a demerit, no matter how one looked at it, so he couldn't read the motives of this mysterious other player. He needed to figure out the truth of why he was transported, and Dunx's story was an important rail to do such a thing, as depending on the situation, there was a chance that this player could become hostile towards him. As Sota started to walk away from the school building, it seemed as though there was someone standing out there, waiting with intent, as this man with glasses glanced up when Sota walked by, which made him pause with surprise. Meanwhile, Yuma and the rest of his party were in the nursing office, and it seemed as though the red-haired male had been there long enough to be able to be almost fully healed after such a battle. The nurse explained to everyone that there was nothing serious injured both on the inside and outside, explaining to Yuma that it looked like he would be able to go back to his normal activities soon enough, which was a good thing, since it would be important to continue adventuring and leveling up despite the failure. The red-haired male glanced down with almost sadness in his eyes, speaking up to thank Kaoru, Sakurako, and Naoto for all they had done for him. The dark-haired male with glasses called for Yuma's attention and thanked him as well for fighting for their sake, but he was still disappointed since it looked like the Static Sword plan was seen through by the upper classes, but he explained the duel wasn't pointless. With that, Yuma thanked Naoto for the words and sat there in silence for a moment, while the nurse would walk away. As Yuma explained to the others, he was going to rest there in the nursing office for a bit, and that everyone could head back to class now. As the three walked away from the nursing office, Kaoru spoke up, and mentioned how it seemed as though Yuma looked better than she thought, but after a few steps of silence together, Naoto spoke up in response and told Kaoru that he was in fact not as fine as it seemed. She was confused by what he meant until Naoto explained that Yuma didn't want anyone to worry about him, and was just using the priest-teacher's words as an excuse, and how Yuma was hiding the real reason why he wanted to rest, proceeding to slam a fist against one of the nearby pillars in frustration, as Naoto explained that the red-haired boy was telling them to leave him alone. As the sun started to set in the sky, the orange light started to reflect off the clouds, and the man in glasses who was waiting outside the gates of the school called out to Sota, which surprised him, both from the shout and the fact that Sota recognized this man. He introduced himself as Kikuchi, and asked Sota if he was the adventurer who saved him, explaining that he had come there to thank him, despite still obviously recovering as he was in an arm cast. Kikuchi told Sota that he looked pretty used to diving into dungeons due to the energy that he was giving earlier when he saved the male, and the fact that he was quick to show that he knew how to destroy all the orcs in one shot. But Kikuchi was aware that Sota was still likely a student due to how young he looked, so this was why the man in glasses assumed he was probably a student at the school. The male started to explain the situation that had happened, and how one of his party members was being hit on by some other adventurers, so he tried to intervene and defuse the situation to let everyone go on their merry way. But it seemed as though this group told Kikuchi and his party about a place to find treasures as a token of their apology. That place was, in fact, clearly a lie, given everything that happened after, as it was just the Orc Lord's nest. Kikuchi stared at the ground with a sad expression, as Sota had the memory of the horde flash in his mind. Sota apologized and felt bad he couldn't have come sooner. However, the man in glasses glanced over and mentioned he did some research beforehand about how the guild gave reminders about groups of orcs, implying that it was partly his own fault. But Sota told the male that sooner or later people would know such a thing when diving into the lower floors of the dungeons. Regardless of what Sota thought, Kikuchi wanted the boy to know that he was grateful to him, causing the dark-haired boy to pause in silence as Kikuchi grinned at him softly. That was until the man in glasses had his eyes widen in recognition, when he realized the other students who walked out of the gates, making his expression flash with horror and anger, as he yelled out at them for having the audacity to trick his party and cause 2 of his members to die. The bully that would harass Sota and the others along with his 2 party members glanced over the direction of Sota and Kikuchi, while the long-haired male would raise an eyebrow in confusion, before recognizing Kikuchi's face, calling him a small fry and grinning while asking how the orc tasted. That caused rage to course through Kikuchi's body as he shoved past Sota, making the bully grin even more, and say that was what his party deserved. Kikuchi tried to get his hands on the other male before Sota would roughly pull him away before anything else could happen, causing him to have to back down as Sota looked up at the students laughing at the sight, insulting the male along with Sota, causing Sota to glare. The oppression from these guys and the school siding with the bullies and further persecuting Class E. It wasn't like Sota had nothing to say, but he was just not the one screaming those words that others would do the actions of. Even so, he couldn't help but still call out for Kikuchi's attention, and tell him that while he couldn't promise anything, he was going to one day take on the students from the upper class. Kikuchi was surprised by the response, since they were strong people, and that would put Sota in danger, but the dark-haired boy just reassured that he was going to train seriously, and that he was more than what he presented. The male in glasses paused for a moment before getting back up with the help of Sota, as he apologized for his behavior, and thanked Sota. But while this moment was happening, it seemed as though a certain someone was watching from afar. Hayase Kaoru. This blue-haired girl was starting to have this kind of dream lately, one where she seemed to be a pupa that was given the chance to one day become a butterfly, turning into said insect with high hopes. However, even with such a transformation, what awaited her was something different from what she imagined. The hope that she had discovered was crushed, after she saw the loss that Yuma had taken, after all the lip service he had given earlier in the first weeks of class, and the guy that she used to look down on was steadily moving forward in life. She would awake in her bed, her eyes slowly opening as she sat up in her bed while thinking about the repetitive dream that had been happening lately, and what she should do next after a feeling of emptiness seemed to have been consuming her. The start of the day happened, and the sun shined down on the town. Kaoru getting dressed and prepared for the school day is normal, as she walked to Sota's house in the morning as usual as they promised as kids. As usual, despite Kaoru upholding this promise, the two would walk together at a distance, with Kaoru in the front, who walked usually without speaking a word to the dark-haired boy. As they approached the buildings that made up their school, her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Yuma walking in front of her, seemingly holding multiple bags and backpacks. The 2 bags that were in his right hand were taken from him, as Naoto chuckled at the sight, and tried to make light of the situation to cheer Yuma up, mentioning how he was working hard, which seemed to make the red-haired boy weakly smile back from the phrasing. Naoto asked if he was carrying all of these bags to Class D, to which the boy affirmed so, and that he was bringing them all the way from the dormitories after he finished cleaning their rooms. Another set of bags were taken from Yuma's left hand as Kaoru grabbed them from him, and walked forward as well, leaving Sota to have to walk by himself. As everyone was on their way to Class E, it seemed as though the bully from earlier was talking to some girls and bragging about how his older brother had been invited to a party, and that it was from a famous branch, which excited the girls and made them ask more questions about it. Naoto glanced over at the scene and felt disappointed that the situation had to happen in his own seat. Yuma called for Kaoru's attention, explaining to her that they were going to dive to floor 6 that day, and asked what she thought about the situation. She looked away with a conflicted expression, and told the red-haired boy that she was not going to join, as she wanted to train by herself a bit more, which the others respected. The blue-haired girl would find herself going for a run by herself in the forest, but even she herself knew the reason why she had stopped dungeon diving with Yuma and the others. Kaoru used to feel comfortable in that party, but it started feeling like she was being forced by something. As Kaoru and Sota walked together to school once more, she thought to herself and wondered what she should use as an excuse that day to not have to be around him. But she had a realization about something and muttered to herself out loud. The two stopped in place and Sota spoke up, asking if something had happened lately, as the girl would glance behind her while thinking about how Sota had clearly put distance between them ever since they'd entered the school. But she knew that Sota was still worried about her given his question. She spoke up and mentioned how she was just surprised that Yuma lost, making Sota ask if she was disappointed, which caused the girl to get frantic since it was the truth. The girl looked down at the ground and explained how she didn't want Yuma to lose, and was disappointed since she didn't feel confident she could keep going to an adventurer school, causing Sota to stare with surprise, before remembering Yuma's face and walking past Kaoru, telling her that it was good enough if she would just do what she saw, which made her think back on all the inspiring words that Yuma used to put out. They continued to walk to school, and as Yuma tried to greet the girl when she entered the classroom, Kaoru immediately got her party's attention, and apologized for skipping the dungeon delving for days, saying that she thought about things and would continue going with them starting that day. They were pretty casual about their responses, as Yuma said that he never knew her mentality was that strong, while Sakurako called this part of Kaoru cute, and Naoto gave no comment, causing Kaoru to be confused by their nonchalant attitude, as they went back to normal with being friendly with her as Sota watched from the distance. They went back to delving into the dungeon together, and Kaoru was barely holding up against the monster, before Yuma would smash his body against it, giving Kaoru an opening. The red-haired male could have landed the finishing blow himself, but it seemed as though he was going to make her take the credit. Things that happened until now and the things that Kaoru didn't see. This process that was in her mind as she sliced the monster in half was one that she had to thank Sota about after increasing her level to 7. But the next day, Sota didn't end up coming to school. A day before the previous chapter, Sota and his little sister Kano had been slowly increasing their levels steadily, and Kano was now at level 7, which made her excited. As the girl started to jump around happily with a grin on her face, the dark-haired boy started to think about how he had understood something after diving into dungeons for a little over a month. All the good hunting places, bridge traps, and places that the players found were all uncommon knowledge in this world, compared to the world where he had come from. Sota had also asked Kikuchi about this, and there was no mistaking about the lack of knowledge about any of these things. But there was one thing that was bugging the boy, and that was about the DLC of this world. The content, scenarios, and stages that would normally be added after a game's release for free or at an additional cost. When Sota and Kano sat down together during a break, he explained to her that it was going to start getting harder to level up, so they were going to dive into the 7th floor of the dungeon, since it would now be fine with their current level. Raising up a finger as emphasis for his next words, Sota explained what would happen on that floor if his knowledge was correct, saying that the two of them should be able to get a certain job there, which Kano acknowledged. This armored knight mentioned in the quest was explained to give people the ability to create and control golems, and the DLC quest was called a Golem's Heart. The new job in general always lacked reception, since the golems were still slow, even if you could ride them, and the player would usually be weaker than the golem in battle. Regardless of that, for an average guy who couldn't log out from this game, there was no job more convenient to choose than this one. After Sota had explained all this, Kano stood up and shouted in surprise about such a skill, feeling excited, as Sota told her they would go to such an area and investigate what she was hyped about. As they walked there together, Sota thought about how they could put some change aside from their jobs, as there was a good hunting ground on that floor as well. But his sister spoke up during their trek and mentioned how she had this two-sword style skill from the start, and wondered if Sota knew anything about it. The boy froze up, remembering that starting off with a skill given to a person was very rare, but he broke out of his silence and shouted with an incredulous expression, confused as to why his sister hadn't told him earlier, and she explained that she didn't understand it. Speaking of starting skills, Sota's glutton was one of them, but two-sword style was one he recognized, immediately remembering the entire paragraph of information about the skill inside his mind. This skill was an extra one normally acquired from the high-ranking job Samurai, and it allowed a person to equip a weapon in each hand to increase the hit rate. After all of his thoughts, Sota finally spoke up, and asked his little sister to confirm that she hadn't fought a monster head-on, to which she affirmed. With that, Sota explained they would encounter a demon wolf named a warg on their way to the location. So he wanted to leave the fight to Kano as a way to give her experience, and it seemed as though she had no hesitance when accepting the task. Sota walked through the forest and looked around until he finally stumbled upon the demon wolf, glancing back at Kano as the two of them stood next to each other, while the wolf stood its ground. He stared forward and saw the canine bare its teeth before charging forward, but Kano charged forward as well. However, the sight of the unlatched jaw made Kano feel a bit of fear, and sliding under the monster as it tried to pounce. After she landed, Kano turned around to see the demonic wolf still in its pounce, and ending up latching its sharp teeth into the tree that was in its path, completely biting through it and having it fall to the ground. The girl stayed silent, sweat dropping, while her brother watched and would wait on the sidelines ready to protect Kano when needed. The warg pounced again and tried to bite at Kano, but the girl was able to focus on her action and use both of the blades in her hands to slash at the body of the monster, effectively killing it in one blow, as blood spilled out of the warg's body before it turned to dust. Sota stared from a distance and realized how strong this skill made his sister, making him glad that Kano was on his side, making him wonder if everyone in this world was as talented as this. Suddenly, the sound of a howl was heard in the distance, and Sota recognized it as one from another warg. The road leading to this point had no struggle, but this was because of Sota's knowledge, so he had finished making preparations for countermeasures. However, he should have remembered that this world didn't have the leeway for preparations, and the worst was yet to come. After defeating the demon wolf and continuing through the forest, Sota and Kano were able to find a secret hole that the two had dropped into, and found what could be a labyrinth, with skulls and stones as the walls. The two made their way through the maze and eventually stumbled upon a stone pillar in one of the rooms, which Sota already recognized from his game knowledge and from the fact that he had already seen these gates earlier. He was glad it was there, and told Kano that they should recognize their magic power while they were at it, making the girl flush with excitement as they walked toward the pillar. Sota's goal on this floor was the Armored Knight task, but he also wanted to get the Faker, which was a skill that one would get from the Thief job. Basically, a person would raise their newbie level and get 3 extra skill slots, change their job to Thief, and acquire Faker. Then they would get the Armored Knight job and dive into the dungeon at their own pace. Kano asked if what she was doing was fine, and the dark-haired male affirmed as so, watching his little sister raise up her left hand to the stone pillar. He walked forward and told her that it looked good, explaining that their goal was just up ahead, and that they should take a quick rest where they were before that. The little girl agreed, and they did as so, before making their way through the rundown walls and finding an array of buildings that were almost castle-like, which was a thought in Kano's mind as her eyes were full of awe. Sota explained that the area was a citadel, and was a place for golems, walking forward and alongside his sister, as Sota already held out his blade in case they would run into anything. They walked forward to the entrance of the citadel and went under the gate, walking past the large golem which surprised and almost scared them, until Kano realized it wasn't attacking them or moving at all. Sota explained that wood golems wouldn't attack unless one was closer to it, but he mentioned that the crystals stabbed into its back were one of the quest items needed for the Armored Knight, as it was a jewel that could be sold for high prices. The person they would sell it to was a woman who wore very luxurious clothing, and had demonic eyes and horns with slits in her eyes. This woman being located in her shop, which was on the 10th floor. At their current level now, the two of them couldn't reach the shop, but they must go there if they wanted to sell it. Sota suddenly became surprised when Kano jumped in front of him with excitement at the mention of this shop, but he pushed her face away and said that they should walk around for now before doing anything. He let the little girl know in advance that skeletons might appear, so they shouldn't let their guard down. As they walked through a door, they indeed ran into some skeletons, as expected, but Sota slashed through them before they would even fully manifest from the air, walking past the dissipating corpses with a neutral expression on his face, as if he weren't worried about them at all. That was when Sota heard some clacking noises in the distance, but he dismissed it and explained to Kano that the castle room was just up ahead, and that there was a chance of something there, which made the girl excited at the possibility of treasure. They were going to try and check out what was going on, slowly walking up to the door and creaking open the door, leaving it slightly ajar. Inside the room was a person sitting lonesome on a throne, and it seemed to be a skeleton monster with horns and high-class looking armor, which made Sota know it was not an ordinary skeleton. If it were a rare monster, he was assuming that the skeleton was at least level 8, but Kano was too focused on something else, telling her brother to look underneath the feet of the monster. There was a small box under the throne which made the girl believe that there could be treasure inside, so she asked if he wanted to fight it. However, the dark-haired boy was slightly sweating, and he told the girl that they weren't going to attempt it as the skeleton seemed to be trouble, and that they should challenge it after defeating some golems first. But Kano couldn't help but think about the box still. They left the citadel and went back to the stone pillar to teleport back home, but they returned the next day without any delay. Sota wondered if Kaoru was okay, as she was looking quite worried, and the blue-haired girl had never made such a face in the original game, so it was highly likely that Sota's words caused the new expression to happen. He wanted to ask her about the static sword and if she knew anything about it, but Sota believed that he should wait and see for now. Kano got Sota's attention and pointed in a certain direction, making him turn his face over and his eyes widen at the sight of a campfire, meaning someone else had been there since they had left the previous day. At the sight of this bonfire, Sota stood there with a sweat drop and was wildly shocked and confused. Given the existence of this bonfire on a lower floor, including in such a secret area, that meant his assumption about the DLC area had all just been proven wrong. He glanced over at the stone pillar gate and had another thought of confusion about everything, his mind racing with answers, and wondered if these people spent the night and did not use the gate, meaning the group was likely still around the area if they didn't know how the gate worked or just chose to not use it at all. Either way, things were likely going to get more dangerous from here. During Sota's thoughts, he was brought back to reality at the sound of someone calling out to him in Kano, causing the two of them to whip their bodies around to the direction of the voice. There was a man walking up to them with a desperate expression, asking if they had any food, since he and his party members were starving. Sota held up his blade just in case, and was confused at the fact that this man had no hesitation when talking to him. The other male seemed exhausted from running over, and hunched over with his hands on his knees, as two other people walked into the area as well. But Sota still held up his guard and asked why they were there. The other man held up his hands in an attempt to show that he was peaceful, explaining that they drove a warg into a corner and were called by a companion, when they ran into a hole nearby and found a tunnel after they'd all grouped up. After all that, they ended up where they are now. The word choice in the story made it sound like they were some people who got here by accident, but it was still going to be a problem since he couldn't go back unless he shook those guys off. Once again, Sota's thoughts were interrupted by the man speaking up once again and asking about food, asking once more if Sota and Kano had some, while the other male would show similar disparity and saying that they were at their limits. Kano was kind enough to take out one of her food rations and give it to them, although reluctantly, causing the third one of the group to get excited at the sight of food, while telling them to not be so stingy, even though that was clearly not what was happening, and she had the right to keep her food for herself if she wanted. Sota internally sighed and knew that he wanted to get rid of these men fast. But once again, his thoughts were interrupted when the new group of people felt more rejuvenated after eating and wanted to explore the castle. The dark-haired boy was surprised by the reaction, and asked if they really were going to the citadel, suggesting that it would probably be better if they went home since they were all tired. The other male was confused by this response and continued, saying his group had found an unexplored map on the 7th floor, so he felt that he and his group should explore it without question. Sota knew that this was going to be a pain, but the way that this man had worded his sentence meant that this group really didn't know anything about the gate, and this way of thinking was expected when one didn't know about the gate. After they walked off, Sota told Kano that the group was likely going to go home on their own after fighting some golems, but the both of them complained about the meal that had been taken from them. Plus, Kano thought they didn't smell good, and pinched her nose as emphasis. Sota explained they had likely been diving for several days, but Kano believed that her brother was a higher level than them. However, Sota believed it could be otherwise. She was going to use a skill called Simple Appraisal on them to see an opponent's stats, but Sota stopped her, as it would let them know that she used it, and would increase an opponent's hate level toward them, or would be considered rude when used on other people. Sota walked up a bit farther and suggested that he should tell this new group their stats, and that they could now use the skill when given their consent, and Kano and Sota were able to see the names, jobs, level, and number of skills the three men had. Kano asked about it, and Sota explained that they were going to retreat after defeating a couple of golems, and that they should give up on monopolizing this hunting ground. But one of the men leaned forward and wondered what they were whispering about. The dark-haired boy started to stutter and suggested that they should split into two groups and explore for efficiency. The two groups went around the place, and Sota was slicing through golems, while Kano would have the job of destroying the cores, until they would become higher level to start selling the gems. The little girl hummed and thought before agreeing, and Sota grinned back before the other group found them again, and said that they found a weird skeleton in the castle, saying it looked strong, and that they should try to form a party to defeat it. Sota glanced at Kano before trying to decline the offer. However, the main guy of the group, Masaru, started to get aggressive, and mentioned how his group was a branch of a group called the Colors, making Sota remember the bully from earlier, which meant this guy was the bully's brother. Sota still tried to refuse and claim that he and his sister would drag them down, but mostly he just didn't want to get involved and get on the bad side of these guys. Even so, Sota knew there was no choice and glanced over at his sister while understanding that arguing wasn't good, so he agreed to take the offer. With that, everyone walked toward the door and Kazuya said that they should use appraisal on it for now, preparing to open the door. Sota believed that they should be able to defeat the skeleton without a problem, as he assumed that it would be around level 9 or 10, since it would be a hard time if it was level 11 or higher. But when Kazuya peeked in and appraised it, he started to run away with fear. The male screamed about how there was no way they could beat it, because it was level 25, immediately getting blown to pieces in one attack, as there was now a hole in the door that showed the monster standing up with its hand outstretched after using the attack.